Booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. I'm Naomi, your host. Our book for this episode is J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye. Our guest is David, who was my rabbi at Beth El Hebrew Congregation in Alexandria, Virginia. David, welcome to the podcast. Please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Naomi. It is so wonderful to see you and to be a guest on this podcast. I've been looking forward to this ever since we first got in touch with each other. Again, my name is Dave Spinrad. I knew you from 7 amazing years in Alexandria, Virginia, where I served as the rabbi of Beth El Hebrew Congregation. Last spring, I had an opportunity to come home. I'm originally from the Bay Area, and I now serve a congregation in Danville, California. I live here with my wife, our almost bar mitzvah age son. That's up in just a couple of weeks. And our oldest daughter actually stayed back in Virginia, where she is finishing school.
It is great to have you on the show. Let's look at the text and see why it remains such a flashpoint in literary history. Published in 1951, The Catcher in the Rye follows 16-year-old Holden Caulfield over 3 days in New York City after his expulsion from Pensy Prep. As he wanders the city to avoid facing his parents, his cynical internal monologue reveals a teenager deeply alienated by social quote-unquote phonies and struggling with the transition into adulthood. It is a foundational exploration of adolescent isolation, the search for authenticity, and the desire to preserve childhood innocence. While these themes of teenage angst are pretty universal, the specific way Salinger voiced them sparked a firestorm of controversy that has not settled in over 70 years. Since its release, the novel has held a permanent spot on the American Library Association's list of challenged books. What began as an outcry against vulgarity, profanity, and blasphemy in the 1950s and 60s evolved alongside the cultural anxieties of each generation. The book has been suppressed for allegedly promoting antisocial behavior, blocked by school boards over its lack of a traditional moral arc, and even removed due to dark real-world associations with high-profile acts of violence. It remains a paradox, simultaneously one of the most taught and most suppressed books in the American literary canon. To bring us into our conversation, the legacy of this book is defined by its constant suppression, yet it remains a staple of our culture. This podcast focuses on literature that has been challenged or removed from the shelves. Given the sheer volume of controversial titles we could cover, what was it about Holden Caulfield's journey or Salinger's writing that made you choose it?
Excellent question. So I received my first copy of Catcher in the Rye in March 1984 at Shakespeare and Company's on the Upper West Side. And there's also one in Paris, like by the Seine. Really like truly iconic bookstores. And I remember my Aunt Suzanne, we were there for my cousin's mitzvah, and my aunt got me a copy. And she was a lifelong educator, taught in public schools for her entire career, was a guidance counselor for years and years and years as well. And when she gave it to me, it meant something. Now, I was also, entering adolescence. I was 13 years old. So it was both the time when sort of starting to see the world a little bit differently, entering adolescence, and the person who gave it to me, I did and do hold in really high regard. So it was that combination. I'm always been an avid reader. I'd never encountered a book that was real in the way it was real, and really for me there was my life as a reader before, and my thinking before, and my life as a reader after.
That's a really great journey. Thank you for sharing that with us. In the text, Holden's narrative voice is our only guide through his 3-day journey. However, as you read his story, you realize his critiques of society come from a very complicated source. Holden is an unreliable narrator. He is quick to judge others for being phony, yet he tells the reader quite plainly that he is a compulsive liar who often lies for no reason at all, and we see that over and over again. How does this contradiction influence the way we are supposed to interpret his criticisms of others and the adult world?
Everybody is full of it. Everybody is inconsistent. Everybody is full of contradictions. Everybody strives to be honest and everyone tells lies. So, I mean, I feel like he's unreliable in the classic sense of how we would describe a narrator. And in his being like a human being, he's more reliable than most narrators we encounter because he is full of contradictions. He calls people out for this and then he does the same thing. So yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the book, that he is an unreliable narrator. I think a lot about how subjective reality is. You and I are on the same call and we're having very different experiences, and I have part of the story and you have part of the story. This is my first real encounter with the anti-hero.
Yeah, I think it was one of my first encounters with the anti-hero as well. And I remember reading it as a teenager. I was probably a little bit older than 13, maybe 15 or 16 when I
Perfect.
first read this. I do remember that Holden had a sort of authenticity for me that I had not seen before in some characters. Of course, there were a lot of young women in books that I related to much more, especially in the classics, maybe not so much other novels, at least not until later, because young adult writing hadn't quite, well, it had started, but it wasn't the full throttle that it is today. So I didn't have that as part of my experience. But this also brings us to the core imagery of the novel and the source of its title, which serves as a major metaphor for his entire outlook on life. The central metaphor in Holden's mind is his dream of being a protector who catches children before they fall into an abyss. He's the catcher in the rye as the children are running through the field of rye, the crops. And it's from a Robert Burns poem about if a body meet a body coming through the rye. And what some critics interpret this as, that abyss that Holden is preventing children from falling into is adulthood. While this seems a selfless desire to preserve innocence, some critics argue it is a sign of Holden's own arrested development. How should we view this fantasy, as a noble instinct to protect the vulnerable, or as a tragic refusal to accept the reality of change?
Yes, let's talk about it both ways. How about I'll take the second one. First, I just take a half a step back. The meaning is based on misunderstanding. You said, right? It's about two passionate lovers. A body meets a body. It's so interesting to think about this title is that, yeah, it is exactly what you said. We derive all this meaning from a fundamental misunderstanding in the original source text that brings it forward. I just sit with that for a little bit. So he's at that place where he's experienced a terrible loss of his brother, Ali, which at that age, I believe he's 13 when his younger brother, Ali, I think Ali's 11. So it's 3 years after his unresolved grief. Of course, he's a kid. And, you sort of extrapolate the family in that environment. I imagine that, sure, they probably went to some fancy Upper East Side psychoanalyst. You just get the idea that this is a cold world where feelings were in neat boxes, and he's been pushed into the real world by this terrible experience. He's a writer, and he's already observing the world like an artist observes a world, being both in it and an observer of it. So there's this sense that he's sensitive to the hypocrisy, which we talked a little bit about before, that unreliable narrator. And he sees that bad things happen to good people. He knows that there's a sense that world that he inhabits doesn't necessarily lead to what it purports to lead to. There's just so many ways I can go at this. What are your thoughts?
I think that fundamental misunderstanding that it's the center of the text, because he has misheard or misremembers the line from the
Yeah.
poem, and he creates this whole fantasy around it that's very rich. But I also wonder about the unexamined grief in his life over his brother's death, and I believe it was from leukemia.
Yes.
So, not something that happens terribly suddenly, but may have gone undetected at that time. And it also seemed to me that his mother is not coping terribly well, or that she has some periods where her grief just overwhelms her. And so he doesn't seem to know what to do with that either. And his parents have packed him off to this boarding school. His older brother is out in Hollywood and already having a life out there. And he just seems really alone to me. And the few people that he's in school with before he does leave Pensy Prep, they're shallow, or at least he's not able to connect with them in a meaningful way. And so the only person left that he does seem to connect with meaningfully is Phoebe, his younger sister. And she's a lovely character, but because he's at boarding school and she's in New York City, he doesn't get to see her that often because he could only go home on weekends or what have you. I do think that there is a lot of contradictions in the novel. There are contradictions in Holden's behavior. It may not necessarily be that he's refusing to accept reality. He seems to accept the reality that his brother is dead, but he doesn't know what to do with that reality. So when Holden is wandering New York, his internal monologue reveals that his only genuine sources of comfort are his younger sister, Phoebe, and the memory of Allie, his brother. His grief is visually represented through the book by a very specific personal item. Throughout his journey, Holden seems tethered to his red hunting hat, which he tells people he was able to buy for only $1. And some people think he got cheated paying that much money for this hat. But it's an accessory that provides him with a sense of security while also marking him as an outsider. Given that both Phoebe and Allie are redheaded, how do you interpret the hat as a symbol of his connection to his siblings and his deep, unresolved grief over Allie's death?
I've read this book many times and I never connected it to them. I have some thoughts on the hat, but I would love to hear how you connect the red hat to the red hair. That would be really neat.
Well, he just seems to put it on in moments where he needs to feel a sense of security. And it seemed to me when I was generating the questions and when I read the book, and I will tell you, the first time I read this book when I was a teenager, I did not make that connection at all, would not have made that connection.
Sure.
I guess I learned how to read literature in a different way, but I was also trained to do so, some of my graduate studies. So it does seem more obvious to me now as a more mature reader that the red hat, because he uses it in moments where he feels threatened or insecure, it does bring him closer to his brother and sister, both of whom happen to be redheaded. This could be completely wrong, but that was my...
It's art. You get to interpret.
Yeah, and that is my interpretation. I do think that it connects to them because he pops it on his head in certain moments, and sometimes he puts the ear flaps down. You know, it's one of those old red hunting hats that had the ear flaps to keep your ears warm. And it's incongruous because it doesn't fit with the suit or the school uniform he is wearing. So I felt that that's why there had to be something more to it, because it doesn't fit with the other things he's wearing. And it seemed to me that this is one of the least phony things that he actually does, is wearing this hat.
I had a slightly different read on. I really got to sit with the red because I really like it. Definitely, he puts it on in times of vulnerability. So let's hold that for a second. He puts it on times where you're vulnerable. You already said it, sort of. I think you might have said it marks him as an outsider. You can't not stand out. But that is exactly the purpose of a hunting hat. You'd want to stand out. So when you're hunting, you don't actually accidentally get shot by another hunter. So one way I was thinking about it, he puts it in times of vulnerability, and I don't want to overreach on it, but there is something about like frailty and mortality and the random. I mean, again, now I'm reading into something that may or may not be there, but there is something about the fragility of life when he puts it on. And there's a scene where Phoebe's wearing it and shakes off and puts it on him. She's like, it's not my thing. This is your thing. Yeah, I got to go back and find all the spots of the red hat now and think about it.
I just think it's something that I never would have seen before. And so that's part of the joy of reading something again, is that you are a different reader. And so you're reading a different book because you find different things in it. And I really love that. Today, modern critics and parents often challenge the book because they worry that Holden's erratic behavior and focus on depression is too, quote unquote, dark or harmful for young readers without context. By the end of the novel, the narrative voice that we have followed through the streets of New York is revealed to be speaking from a psychiatric facility, which may have been evident to a discerning reader from the beginning, because the epilogue starts off. And if you're paying attention, you realize he is out in California near his older brother.
Yeah.
This revelation contextualizes everything that we've just read. So in your opinion, how does this setting change the conversation from one of simple teenage rebellion to a much more serious discussion about adolescent mental health?
Great question. It's really interesting. That was one thing I noticed from the start, right? He's a narrator telling about something that happened recently. There's two Holdens in the book. There is the Holden who's actually going through those 3 nights in New York City. And then there's a Holden who's slightly older talking about it, right? It's such a cool literary device. And I did a little dive, and there is some ambiguity. I've always assumed, and I think tonight when I go to bed, I still will believe that he is institutionalized. He's all the way across the country. His older brother is nearby. He has some space. He's getting the help he needs, but he's not all by himself. Excuse me. He self-describes, I don't know to quote the book, I almost got tuberculosis, or darn near got tuberculosis. And is even now sort of lying to us, really lying to himself by not just saying where he is. There's some really wonderful, wonderful ambiguity in that. You were a kid. I was a kid. We have kids who used to be younger kids. Just like we knew and we were exposed to much more than our parents wanted to believe we were. The same for our kids. And I just never really understood, why not just be real? Why shelter your kids? And why pretend this isn't also a part of life? But this is also really interesting to turn back, because these idealized, or these male perfections that were very much contextual with the time. You think about what he went through. He was a World War II vet, right? And he was in action. He was Omaha Beach on D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, liberated one of the camps. Like how could you have seen more, right? But it's interesting. He came back and didn't write about that. He was not like so many of the other ones who came back who did write about war. He wrote about the family, and his canon is limited, but it's also just evergreen. And at that time, you think of the characters. What's his name? Stratlater, Mr. All-American, perfect roommate. You think about Sally, who he so idealizes. Even Jane, right? There's these paradigms of perfection, and then they're all sort of, the makeup is cracked. Later's a knucklehead. You just see like the beauty of this woman who Holden really like holds on a pedestal in Jane. Then you have other, like the real America. You have the one young woman who used to be a burlesque dancer. He calls up really late. Then there is the prostitute. Like there's the idealized America and the real America. That it's all kind of happening simultaneously. So I know I'm sort of digressing, but talking about mental health, I feel like having conversations with our kids about the way the world is, including that all of us at some time have our ups and downs, and some of it is more significant and more enduring when it comes to mental health. The more we can normalize that, we can destigmatize it. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I'm just thinking about like, why are we not talking about this? Why would you ban this book so everyone can be like Stratlater? Nobody's like Stratlater, and Stratlater is more broken than the rest of us because he doesn't know how broken he is.
And I think you have a good point that we should be having these conversations around mental health. And I think we've made some progress since, the days of Salinger and post-World War II veterans who did not talk about any of the things that may have happened to them. Now, at least we can say there is such a thing as post-traumatic stress. And being in a war can do that to you, but also experiencing a life event like having your brother die of leukemia can also create a lot of post-traumatic stress. That is a traumatic event. And I think I mentioned that his mother was not quite keeping it together. In the 50s, she would have been, taking tranquilizers, which a lot of women did. I don't think the adults were all right. Kids may not have been all right, but the adults weren't all right either. And I think we still need to talk about that. And now maybe we're tranquilizing ourselves or taking the edge off by looking at social media rather than having the real conversations that we need to do about mental health, even though I think some of the stigma around mental health has changed quite a bit. Holden's clinical reality is a far cry from how censors viewed the book in the 1970s and the 80s, when it was banned from school libraries by administrators who feared that Holden was simply creating a manual for rebellion or a dangerous example for youth. There's a persistent argument in school board meetings that Holden Caulfield is a poor role model because he lacks a traditional redemption arc, or there's no clear moral lesson to take from The Catcher in the Rye. However, I'm not of the opinion that Salinger wrote Holden that way as a character at all. Literature often serves as a mirror for the human condition rather than a manual for perfect behavior. So when we look past his cynicism and his mistakes, what vital lessons can we learn from Holden about the necessity of empathy and the struggle to remain authentic in a complex world?
I think that authenticity is something that we reach for and we have moments of, but I also think that we learn to put on masks that keep us from our authentic self. It's how we function in society. And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking those masks are our real selves. And I think about him, whether he's being authentic or inauthentic, he's struggling with the reality, right? There's that other scene when they're in the bar and he sees the woman who used to date his brother with the officer. In that moment, to me, he is a reliable narrator. Their phoniness is ending. Oh, come and sit with us, and he wants nothing to do with them. In that moment, he's seen it objectively. I just think that we need to remain empathetic to others and to ourselves, because we are our own unreliable narrators, and we do put on masks because that's what we learn to do. And quite honestly, I think that's actually quite appropriate at times. We don't want to see the full us in every scenario. It's also problematic.
There is something to be said for social tact. It's the social grease that keeps society moving. I want to talk about the authenticity, because I think that that's really important. He is trying to connect with other people, but he's not always doing it in an authentic way.
Nice.
And I think it's his desperateness that makes him inauthentic. Like when he's talking to cabbies or one of his classmates' mom, she's on the train with him into New York City in very late hours. Why is she out and about at midnight on the train to New York City? I think in those moments when he is trying to connect, he is the most inauthentic about it. And by not showing his own vulnerability to other people, he fails in a lot of those connections, which is really hard to read. One of the earlier episodes for the podcast was on The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. And my colleague Paige, who was the guest for that episode and had picked the book, she's a scholar of young adult writing and especially young adult writing written by other young adults. And one of the things she pointed out about The Outsiders is how it starts out with this line, he came out from the darkness of the movie theater into the bright sunlight. But the novel ends with that same line. But by then we know that Ponyboy is writing that line and he's written this whole story that we've just read. And I think the book ending of Catcher in the Rye with Holden talking about being in a facility, though he doesn't say he's in a psychiatric facility, but being out there in California, this gets back to something you pointed out earlier. He is writing this story. We just don't know it until the end. And maybe S.E. Hinton had read Catcher in the Rye, and that's where she got this construct from of how to write, The Outsiders with Ponyboy's first and last line, showing us that he had constructed the story. And Holden is also constructing his own story.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
Who knows?
I love it. What a mark of a classic, a beyond. We can keep reading this book and unpack it in different ways and come back to it at different stages in our lives. I haven't read this book for a very long time. I don't know, at least 25 years. Right. It always remained as sort of like a large dot on the timeline of my literary life. God, this book is so depressing. I'm just not I'm not in that place anymore. So I read it as a parent. I read it with so much more distance than I had when it was like really speaking to me. But I was also able to be a little more dispassionate and notice things I was incapable of noticing the way I notice them now, but that I needed to then to make me the person I became now. One of the things that happens is woven throughout the book is his aversion to change and the inevitability of change. And the part that really stands out is where's his favorite place in the world? The Museum of Natural History, where the Eskimo is always fishing, right? Nothing changes there. And tell me what you think about that.
So I have a different reaction to that Museum of Natural History.
Oh. Okay.
Just because when I read Primate Visions, which is an anthropological text by Donna Haraway, it's nonfiction, she describes how, and I forget the name of the explorer, the hunter, whatever they were called, and maybe their name should be forgotten, but they created this exhibit that's in the Museum of Natural History in New York City of this ape family. And how a hunter specifically got a large male gorilla, an adult female gorilla, teenaged male gorilla, and a younger female gorilla, and kind of set them up as this family exhibit. And Haraway's critique of this is that's not how apes live, right? What was striking me reading this now, since I have been to that museum in natural history and I had read Primate Visions, is that Holden is resistant to change because one of the big changes in his life was the death of his brother. And that was so unexpected and so devastating. And a child dies. Does anybody think that that is fate or should happen? None of us do. So he'd been faced with this hugely devastating change. And I think that it is making him resistant to change so that he doesn't want to grow up quite. In some ways, he's so much more grown up than he needs to be for someone who's a 16, 17-year-old boy, and he had to be that grown up. But in other ways, he is fighting it tooth and nail. I think that the Museum of Natural History and its kind of preserving in amber the way things never were is emblematic of that resistance to change.
I like that interpretation.
I would not
It's
have had
art.
that interpretation when I read it as a 16-year-old myself. Not at all.
There's like so many different episodes to think about. And one of the episodes that just breaks my heart because Holden he's spiraling and he's wet and he's exhausted. He hasn't been sleeping. He's been drinking, and he goes to Mr. Antolini's house, his teacher, Mr. and Mrs. Antolini's house, and she's in the kitchen. She's making coffee, and then she goes to bed. Mr. Antolini, who he really likes, who seems like he's someone he really connects with, he goes to him when he has nowhere else to go, and he brings him in. And he makes a bed for him, and Holden passes out, and he wakes up, and Antolini is like stroking his head, which hurts my heart. Even though it might not have been a sexual past, but it's impossible for me as a reader to think it wasn't. I could be wrong, but I can't get, I've never been able to get anywhere else with it. Because he's someone he trusts, he's someone who's wise, and he has this one line. Salinger hardly ever tells and doesn't show. That's why we have so much to talk about, right? But there's one line that, like, I give him it because I think there's still a lot of meat on the bone, even though he gives it to us. I wrote it down. He says, "The mark of the immature man is that he wants to die nobly for a cause, while the mark of the mature man is that he wants to live humbly for one." What do you think about that in the context of the book and our conversation? And let's make it gender neutral, make it person, because what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think that Mr. Antolini is making a move on Holden.
Yeah.
And I think that his older wife in this situation is a beard, and they have some sort of arrangement. I was very proud of Holden in a way for getting himself out of that situation immediately when he felt that his own spidey sense was kind of set off. And he's not derogatory about it. There's a couple comments throughout the book about a flit or a flitter is how he describes what would have been a queer man at that time. But he doesn't seem to care. It just seems to be there are these people in the world and that's how they are. I actually really liked that scene, but the line, I actually love that line because I think it's so true. I do. I do think, and maybe this is heavily influenced by the fact that the previous episode is The Yellow Birds. And so that's the book I read right before I read Catcher in the Rye. And that's a war story. And it's about young men going off to Iraq and some of them getting killed, and they drink the Kool-Aid a bit, at least in the beginning, which is why they joined the service in the first place. They're thinking about dying nobly. And what happens is the protagonist of that story, he learns that he has to live humbly. And so I think that actually fits that story very well. And I think that that is a moment of what's shown to Holden as a way to live authentically or to live with authenticity instead of thinking he's going to do something noble and huge, that he can just live humbly and still have a big impact in that way too.
Amen. Yeah.
So in the 1980s, the book gained a much darker reputation because it was found in the possession of unstable individuals like Mark David Chapman and John Hinckley Jr. after high-profile acts of violence. Yet, despite decades of modern challenges regarding its language and suitability, The Catcher in the Rye endures. As we wrap up this episode, what is the core message or final thought that you want to leave with our audience regarding why The Catcher in the Rye still deserves a place on our bookshelves?
Through Holden and through the episodes, help me to understand human behavior and human nature and myself. Like I said, when I started, there was before I read it and ever since. It was the first book I ever read that was real. And it's important. It's an important book. It'll always be an important book. It's way more how life is than almost every other book, except books of its kind. Yeah, all the banned ones.
Yeah, all the banned ones. That's very important. People should be able to read a book that is real for them. And I think The Catcher in the Rye is that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and discussing this lovely and gritty and dark and all the things with me. Our next episode will be a discussion of The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. Thank you for joining us. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here.